So it's very exciting today. This is a really exciting kickoff to our year for the seminar series. And we're so very grateful that Zahra had agreed to launch our year for us. So Zahra's Stardust PhD was awarded in 2019. She's a socio-legal researcher whose work is concerned with the intersections of law, sexuality, labour and justice. And Zahra's academic work draws on her experience as a porn performer and producer. She also has 15 years experience working on diverse social justice and human rights issues with community organisations, NGOs and UN bodies. And I also believe that your PhD, Zahra, won the Dean's Award. So this is very exciting. Yay, Zahra. Okay. Just letting everyone know that we are recording the session via Zoom and we have some people online, and then the recording becomes available later if you need to use it. Okay. Zahra.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming, and thank you to Karen and Centre for Social Research for having me here. I told my friend Hilary Caldwell, who also did her PhD here, that I was having a bad mental health day today. And she said, don't worry, put your smart glasses on, and academia is exactly like pornography. It's just a performance. So as the title suggests, I'm going to be talking about pornography, just in case you're in the wrong room, and about my PhD research, which was a mixed methods study that involved legal research, archival research, qualitative interviews, and what I called autopornographic ethnography, which was detailed my experience working in the industry. But before I start, I do want to also recognise the Bejigal people as the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and recognise that we're here on stolen land. And I want to note that the only place that possession of pornography is prohibited in Australia is in the Northern Territory among Indigenous communities since the Northern Territory intervention. So there's a really fraught history there by which pornography regulation has been used as a tool to criminalise and control Aboriginal communities. I'm not going to give an overview of my whole thesis because it was a little over the word limit, so it's over 100,000 words, but you can download it if you like. But today I want to talk about the impact that porn performers have had on porn production. And I want to show the different ways in which pornography is imagined by regulators on the one hand, and then by porn providers on the other. And I argue obviously that porn providers have a much more sophisticated and embodied understanding of pornography. Is there something I should click that's different to this? Maybe because you just click it. Okay. But first, some porn. It's 2 AM and I'm filming a threesome scene in a hotel suite in downtown Toronto in front of a BBC News journalist. The hotel is abuzz with an influx of professional purveyors of pornography from around the world, performers, producers, pioneers, all in town for the 9th annual Feminist Porn Awards. The awards themselves are a spectacle: chandeliers, champagne, evening gowns, burlesque shows, a VIP party. One could be forgiven for thinking that we were at the Oscars, only the names of the categories are somewhat sassier, including the Golden Beaver Award, Smutty School Teacher Award, Hottest Dyke Film, and Best Boygasm. And the trophies are shaped like various kinds of butt plugs. I'm awarded Heartthrob of the Year, and to celebrate, I'm shooting a film with James Starling and Wolf Hudson, who are porn performers from San Francisco and Los Angeles. James and Wolf are either side of me, each with one of my feet in their mouths, and the BBC journalist just sits in the corner studiously taking notes. He's so quiet I forget that he's there until I'm editing the footage later and I catch a glimpse of his feet. Scene 2. The jet lag is overwhelming, but somehow I've found the stamina to make it to the opening night of the Berlin Porn Film Festival. The program features a mix of categories, including fetish porn, gay porn, lesbian porn, queer and trans porn, sex worker shorts, political porn, and experimental porn. One of the most entertaining categories is fun porn, which includes fisting porn with sock puppets, a musical horror drama centered on philosopher George Bataille's Story of the Eye, Wes Hurley's Zulushka, a gay adaptation of Cinderella meets Tom of Finland, where the protagonist loses his boot and the potential suitors line up to give him rim jobs, and a pious interpretation of the Bible, fuck me in the ass because I love Jesus. This year, the festival had a focus on sex and disability, featuring films like Yes We Fuck and Don't Pray For Us, challenging stereotypes and portraying people with functional diversity as desirous and desiring. Much of the work is festival release only, so it's a rare opportunity to see experimental, low-budget film with aesthetics and bodies and practices that otherwise might not be sold or screened on commercial platforms. And the atmospheric pleasure of the cinema is so far removed from these supposedly isolated experiences of porn viewership at home or in a couple. I can hear around me gasps, laughs, groans, murmurs, heckling, affectionate giggles, and viewers are asking questions of the filmmakers during the Q&A. The conversations continue in the hallways, bar, stairwell, pavement, and the queue for the gender-neutral bathrooms. Scene 3. It's official Pride Month in Amsterdam, and the city is alive for summer. And I cycle past the Homo Monument, 3 pink triangles of granite, a memorial to commemorate gay men and lesbians who have been persecuted. I visit the iconic bronze statue of Belle in the Old Churches Square, erected in honor of sex workers. I drop in for tea with Mariska Major, founder of Prostitutes Information Centre, an educational student centre that's open to students, visitors, and sex workers, which has a museum of sex work. Carla Banting and I are there presenting a squirting workshop called Get a Hand Job in a leather bar, funded by the city's Pride Committee. I'm screening 6 of my films at an independent cinema for a sold-out session. The cinema has been running non-profit special films for more than 30 years and was founded in 1983 by a squatters movement. The cinema has only 39 seats, a number that has stayed historically low so that it could technically operate as a sex cinema and screen non-classified hardcore films. Despite screening their films wherever possible on 16 and 35mm reel, the cinema is the first in the Netherlands where you can pay for your drinks and tickets using Bitcoin. A few years ago, Madison Young, who's a feminist pornographer, sat in my kitchen. We were eating vegan pancakes. She was telling me about the revolutionary potential of DIY porn. And she had just released her book, The DIY Porn Handbook, a guide to documenting our own sexual revolution. The promise to me was quite alluring, that the affordability of new technologies, camera equipment, computers, webcam, could ultimately blur the distinctions between who is a performer, who is a producer, who is a distributor, who is a consumer. And some scholars have thought about this as a kind of sabotage of corporate porn monopolies. Now with smartphones, with apps, DIY porn can democratize bodies on film. Porn is no longer confined to studios or corporations. It can be filmed on your phone, can be filmed by your friend, and there's a whole new genre called iPornography. So feminist pornographies have been described as a genre and a political movement, DIY porn as a socio-political movement, and producers have taken up the charge of porn pioneers like Candido Royale, who insisted that to ensure our voices were heard, women must take control of the means of production. And individuals are following Annie Sprinkle's famous insistence that the answer to bad porn isn't no porn, it's better porn. So we're all being urged to make the porn you want to see and change the world one orgasm at a time. And in my own experience as a porn performer, I witnessed the richness and value of independent pornography as participatory cultures, local grounding, their international influence. But I also knew that independent porn producers were navigating contexts where production, screening, and sale of porn was criminalized, technological contexts in which would gatekept who could participate, and privatized platforms that were sanitizing online space, as well as tube monopolies that were trying to co-opt sexual subcultures. The current trends in regulation were focusing on how to prevent exposure to pornography, prohibiting extreme pornography, and treating pornography as a public health crisis. Alternative pornographies is a very loose and imperfect and in some ways problematic term to describe a collection of different movements and actors and projects. It includes feminist pornographies, which may be about women's agentic desires and subjectivities, or queer pornographies, which are unbounded by gender binaries or sexual essentialism, ethical pornographies, which emphasize fair payment and workplace conditions, and DIY pornographies, which encourage decentralized and independent production. So sometimes there's considerable overlap between those, but sometimes they're each very distinct projects and sometimes conflicting projects, which shouldn't be conflated. There's also substantial literature on alternative pornographies that have approached these claims of democratization and revolution with a lot of caution. And there's plenty of text that can cause us to reflect on the limitations of independent pornographies, mostly from scholars of color, from disability and trans and gender diverse folk for whom this kind of white, ciscentric, ableist, feminist visions of what constitutes liberation through visibility have fallen awfully short. Also, this claimed opposition to mainstream pornographies obscures a very substantial overlap and entanglement between these categories that are increasingly elastic. So with performers cutting across genres and industries, working in both independent and corporate productions, that division can be very ambiguous. And in fact, in my interviews, producers often constructed the mainstream through their iterations of repudiation from it. We are not that, we are not that. And they had this kind of fantasy idea of what constituted mainstream pornography, which didn't really always make sense as a conceptual discursive category. And I haven't gone into it here, but happy to talk about it later. But there's many discussions, very rife discussions about how this binary between what's good porn and bad porn, mainstream and alternative porn, further reproduces stigma that's associated with pornography generally. The year that I attended the Feminist Porn Awards, there were ongoing conversations about who decides whether the porn is feminist. Is it enough for the producer to label it as feminist, for audiences to interpret it as feminist? Should we require testimonials about the experiences of the performers on set? And Chanel Gallant, who was one of the founders of the awards, wrote in her reflections 10 years later that in her effort to make feminist content more visible and more celebrated, the criteria of the awards focused too much on representation. And in doing so, she writes, they missed an opportunity to incorporate some of the critical insights of what she calls sex worker feminism 101. Pay women well for work that is feminized, undervalued, and often precarious. So one of the catalysts driving production ethics have been sex workers moving behind the camera who have recognized the limits of visibility as a political intervention and said, look, representation is not enough. We need to demand reflection on the labor practices. So I'm going to detail some of the interventions they've made behind the scenes. In my research, performers described how being a performer themselves and a sex worker led to an ethic of care that framed their entire approach to production. So Gallivanting, for example, said that being a performer helps in developing your code of ethics. It helps you understand what it means to distribute your work in the way that you do. She said that the performer's experience was always the paramount question and the politically and ethically the highest value because they're the person on whose back this piece of media is made. And I think a lot of producers often forget that. Prioritizing the performer experience really does affect the way that we can produce, how fast we can produce. And she had pioneered a movement called slow porn movement, which had a focus on the process, not just the product. And it affects how we distribute, what our release looks like, and every level of the business. Another really notable feature that came up in my interviews was a collaborative approach that devolves some of the power that has traditionally exercised between producers and performers, and demonstrates kind of less hierarchical forms of production. So often performers themselves are treated as directors of the scene, and then the directors take a back step and are more of a facilitator role or a space holder, or some even refer to this as kind of bearing witness. And that approach sometimes also extended to the product afterwards, so the ownership of the final media product. So sometimes that might be jointly owned between the performers and the producers. They might make decisions together about where they're going to submit the film or license the film or distribute it. That might be shared with performers as part of a trade share agreement. There might be a profit sharing or royalty system in place. And performers also participated in affiliate systems where they could share and promote each other's work and receive certain percentages of sign-up fees and stuff like that. So those initiatives recognize the central importance of performers and sought to share the wealth more equitably among producers, directors and performers. Queer and feminist pornographies are also contributing to the active cultivation of consent cultures. And this is particularly by virtue of the sex workers who are working in those spaces and in porn more generally. Producers reported that it was important to them to offer full and frank disclosure about on-set expectations and contractual obligations so that performers had transparent details about what was going to happen on the set. So how long are you going to be required? What acts are you going to be expected to perform? What you're going to get paid, whether there'll be just behind the scenes interviews, how many people are going to be there in the crew at the time. One performer wanted to know, is she going to get paid if she does an orgasm? Because that might be important to some producers, but not others. Performers also raised additional aspects that were relevant to them. They wanted to know clarity about what would happen to the footage after the shoot, how it's going to be edited, how it's going to be distributed, because that might affect what they charged for it, depending on what was going to happen to it later. Whether the scene could be sold in full rather than licensed to a third party. And one performer recalled an experience where she thought that it would stay within a certain website, but then it got sold in full afterwards. So that was important to know where it could potentially end up, including the real risk also of porn piracy and whether the producer had some kind of policy in place to deal with or to follow up on porn piracy. So having that information in advance of the shoot meant that performers would be able to review their contract, raise any issues, negotiate terms and conditions before the filming began, instead of being kind of upsold at the time of the shoot. Another technique that was used was to not actively recruit for performers, but to let people come to them from their own initiative. So Domino from Slip magazine said, "We only want content from people who share it." Contributors were often drawn by word of mouth through personal vouching systems, and larger companies who did advertise often had built-in cooling off periods prior to shooting. And producers described feeling a responsibility towards new performers in particular, and allocated additional time to discuss what possible implications on their lives, including the impact of stigma on their employment or family life, custody, and relationships. And Lucy B felt that this was really crucial because once the material's in the public domain, it's very difficult for anyone to control. While some jurisdictions have proposed mandatory condom laws for porn production, Australian performers were really concerned with having genuine choice over their safer sex practices. So now we have new technologies, and STI and HIV treatments mean that the definitions of what constitutes safer sex have changed. And there's now multiple means to reduce risk of transmission, from condoms, gloves, stands. And it was important that those things were available free to people on set, and they didn't necessarily have to bring their own, but that kind of personal protective equipment was supplied by the producer. To regular testing, serosorting, the use of PrEP, treatment as prevention. And some performers would be working with people with whom they were already fluid bonded. So they wanted some safer sex options that matched their circumstances, instead of having one compulsory method imposed upon them. They also wanted non-allergenic, paraben-free options provided on set, and they wanted their health information to remain confidential. And that was really important, particularly in lights. In 2011 in the US, there were about 15,000 porn performers on the American Medical Association database whose identity details were leaked, including their addresses, and their HIV and STI statuses were published online. So privacy emerged, particularly from the performers I spoke to, as a really important aspect of ethical production. They were concerned about stalking, harassment, doxing, and risks that were generally heightened with a broader increase in digital surveillance. The geolocation devices on your smartphones meant that if you're posting on social media, that might notify authorities that you're shooting in a certain place that might not be lawful. Now we have mandatory data retention laws that require ISPs to record details about phone calls, email conversations, issues like film piracy. The legal and immigration statuses of performers could make them vulnerable to arrest and deportation when traveling. So privacy was really important. And they wanted systems in place that meant that their identity documents could not be misused. So instead of somebody taking a copy of their license and holding onto it, they wanted systems like you could cite somebody's ID and sign something to say you've cited this person's ID without storing it. And in this context, producers were also quite conscious in their marketing of the project to minimize stigma implications. So some producers gave performers the opportunity to review everything and approve all the content after it had been edited. Luna Trash said that they had a policy of deleting all content that was not approved by the performers, and said nothing's going to be printed unless they're totally happy, even if you end up with just one photo from the whole shoot. And others gave performers the option of deciding what level of exposure they were comfortable with in advertising. So Sense8 Films actually came up with their own choose your own adventure style model release, where they asked performers, do you need your face to be out of promotional things? Or do you want your image only hard copy but not online? Or not as part of advertising material, or only body shots to be made public but your face gets kept behind the paywall. Those kinds of practices that just provided some recognition of the realities of porn stigma and a care for the privacy needs of performers. Producers also took various steps to encourage responsible consumption among audiences, giving cues, for example, about how to read and interpret the films. So consumers were invited to make generous and positive comments about the performance because they're people. And producers had different ways in which they moderated forums. So sometimes they would approve comments before they went live. They would delete comments they thought were nasty or demeaning. So one producer said he would tell his staff he'd have to explain to them why it's not an appropriate thing to say about this person who's just put themselves naked on the internet for everybody to see. And Helen Corday, who was a performer running her own solo site, said she didn't even put a comment function in the videos because it was important to her that there never be a moment where the model might be insulted. Porn performers in Australia are also active in adult and youth sex education. This is actually a shot from Berlin where we did a live fisting and ejaculation demonstration. But also sex workers in Australia generally have worked with young people in a range of different capacities. And in 2015, Helen Corday worked with Fitzroy High School to host 5 different community forums. One of them was called Pornography in Teenagers, Developing Porn Literacy, and actually they had to run it twice because of the high demand, because performers were there speaking alongside sexologists and family planning and psychologists, and the feedback was that the presence of the porn performer removed the skepticism that the teenagers had towards the community concern about their porn use, and it lent some credibility to the sexual biases in the eyes of the teens. And the same year, Claire Watson sold out theatre piece Gonzo, brought together 4 teenage boys in conversation with Helen and gallivanting, and on stage they had an improvised scene where they could ask performers anything. And the show had been based on peer-led focus groups among teenage boys aged 12 to 18 in Melbourne. And it really depicts them as conscious and critical media consumers. They were able to ask the performers anything, and what they asked were things like, were they having a good time? How do they maintain romantic relationships? They wanted to know if the activities were consensual, and they were paying attention to things like whether the performers were using lube. Some content also challenges classification categories themselves of what constitutes pornography, like what is intimacy and what is hardcore. So there's one Australian site, for example, that features videos of people masturbating, but it only shows their faces. And then the work of Sense8 Films interrogates what constitutes explicit material. So their films involve power exchanges and play piercing, and they've been described in the academic literature as hardcore as they get, but they don't necessarily contain any sexually explicit content. So I think in part, these films reflect a broader context in which explicit sex is widely available, so therefore it's lost some economic value. There's a shift away from that focus on maximum visibility. Even Playboy no longer features nudes. But also in the displacing sex, they're situating eroticism and desire as outside particular body parts or sexual practices. So Sense8 would insist that they value a person's time in that performance as the labor, regardless of whatever explicit activities or the level of nudity that they were contributing. So I think that was a move to disrupt the classification of sex as something that is different to other kinds of intimacy that we might see in our media. And similarly, Helen paid a flat fee for scenes with no expectation for orgasm because she wanted to reassess the money shot as being this kind of pinnacle of sexual encounters. Many queer and feminist producers were also invested in building an archive that recorded sexual cultures, politics, and practices that were happening in their communities. So a lot of the producers that I spoke to who ran Shot with Desire or Slip magazine were already immersed in subcultures of queer performance. And so they had been inspired to produce by events like lesbian strip club Girlesque, and they wanted to recreate in the tradition of the iconic dark magazine Wicked Women. And Sense8 Films also had produced what they called a docu-portrait about BDSM and intimacy. So pornography was seen as a way by some to create and reflect and preserve those communities of cultures. Another of the key provocations that alternative independent pornographies are making is to the regulatory framework. And around the world, producers are using the medium of porn as a vehicle for protest. So we have a very archaic, outdated classification system in Australia, whereby our X category is very narrow. It precludes fisting. Fisting is one of the things that it precludes. There's a long list of fetish activities that are all excluded, including things like golden showers and spanking. It's the only category that has no violence in it. You can see violence in the G category, but not in an X category. And so sex is treated as really exceptional in our system, and it's a system that is very ableist in some of the things that it includes and prohibits. So some people were making films specifically in response to that. And particularly showcasing acts that had been banned from legislation. And I interviewed Terry Flew, who was on the chair of the Australian Law Reform Commission at the time that they reviewed the Classification Act in 2012, and he suggested that the current system actually promotes disrespect for the law. So in the meantime, regulators and porn producers are having these really fundamentally different conversations about what pornography is, what it does, who it's for, and how we situate it. And in Australia, although it's regulated at a federal level in terms of classification, states each decide their own enforcement. So in most states and territories, in most states in Australia, it's heavily criminalised to produce porn, to sell porn, and to screen porn, to advertise porn. And in some states, there are penalties of up to $200,000 and imprisonment. So in Australia, there still continue to be raids on adult businesses, mostly coincide with electoral campaigns. Australian companies have been prosecuted for producing objectionable material for sale in Melbourne. An adult retailer in Sydney was imprisoned for selling unclassified DVDs in an adult store on Oxford Street. Australian customs have refused shipments that feature female ejaculation on the premise that it must be urination, and so therefore it must be a fetish, which must be refused classification, which obviously demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding about basic anatomy. And there's been reports that the Australian Classification Board have also instructed trainees that women with small breasts could be seen as underdeveloped, and therefore they might appear to be under 18, which is also excluded from the X category. So it's not just that you are under 18, if you appear to be under 18, you also can't be included, which poses all sorts of implications for slash fiction and anime and different genres like that. Category classified magazines have also reported routine practices of editing in a labia to meet classification requirements that genitals have to be discreet in publications. There was a whole Hungry Beast episode on it some years ago. So performers very much saw the law as out of date, politicians as out of touch. The whole framework is very much archaic and absurd and not reflective of their politics. Queer film content has also been disproportionately affected. A number of films like I Want Your Love, which featured explicit homosexual sex, were refused classification to screen at the Melbourne Queer Film Festival. Bruce LaBruce's film LA Zombie, in which a gay zombie is able to resurrect the dead by having sex with their wounds, which I think in a way is quite beautiful because it's about the life-affirming and generative qualities of the body fluids. but maybe some consent issues. It was banned at the Melbourne International Film Festival, but then the director of the Melbourne Underground Film Festival said that they would screen it, and his house was raided by police. So pornography continues to be imagined by governments as something that's dangerous, that's corruptive, contagious, that requires mass surveillance software to control it. And just a couple of months ago, our new Federal Department of Home Affairs proposed that we use facial recognition software, and that would be a good way in order to verify the ages of people who are watching pornography online. And we've really much followed the UK in this aspect, although the UK have abandoned their plans because it's completely unworkable. But Australia seems to be persisting. And obviously this has really serious implications for potential creation of a database of porn users. People's browsing histories or their personal sexual preferences that could be sold or leaked or hacked or misused by governments or private companies, or even shared with law enforcement agencies. And so if we think back to Madison Young at the beginning, there was this real techno-utopian aspect to this belief in the democratizing potential of DIY porn that really put its faith in the internet, because that classification system was so redundant and out of date. Everyone was like, don't worry, we've got the internet. But of course, online pornography now is regulated by new systems of platform governance where private companies now make decisions about what constitutes community standards. But they don't have the same accountability mechanisms that classification boards or governments or judicial decision makers would have had to publish or provide reasons for their decisions. So now we're seeing the sanitization of online space, new community guidelines and standards across social media sites, streaming platforms, payment processes that are effectively erasing sexual communication, expression, and critical conversations about sex. Sex workers are regularly shadow banned, suspended from platforms, and there's a few avenues for recourse or transparency. It's really difficult to obtain billing if you reside in Australia. So adult sites already are seen as high risk. So billing incurs higher fees, but it's really difficult to get billing if you exist in Australia, and credit card companies are very reluctant to process adult transactions. So there's a lot of independent porn providers that are effectively being locked out of the market because they can't afford to access billing. And Australian producers reported that the banks will often refuse to process their transactions. So one said directly, we just don't deal with adult content. Another said that they'd had a lot of money in the bank, but the bank had just sent them a letter that said, sorry, we don't like how your company tarnishes our brand's reputation. And another that said, we had an account closed recently because we were unable in a particular time frame to convince the billing company that the money was coming from our website was not being used to fund terrorism. And then if you use alternative payment platforms, often they don't accept adult content, and producers often said that they had lost thousands of dollars by things like PayPal just taking their money. So those financial barriers really created a disincentive for independent producers to make porn, operating like a kind of porno tax, and it really impacted their financial viability. Also, since the advent of foster sister in the US, the platforms now have a legal incentive to change their terms of use, and the Survivors Against Sister website has a documentation of a number of different things that have happened since then on a range of websites, from Craigslist to Google Drive, Google Play, Microsoft, and different policy changes that have prohibited sexual speech, imagery, services, emojis. And I think a further danger here is that the discrimination doesn't always occur on the basis of behaviour, but sometimes on the status of being a sex worker. So sex workers are potentially being profiled, and news sources have even reported that porn stars have been targeted by facial recognition software at airports and things like that. So corporations can discriminate not just on someone's immutable characteristic, but on the algorithmically reduced position of an individual. And these are a few quotes from my interviewees about the kinds of things that billing companies screen for. So somebody who dressed up as a vampire, they had fake blood, but they weren't allowed to depict that. They thought it was violent. they screen for words like drink, which makes it difficult to write that you drink someone's squirt or drink someone's ejaculate because it's associated with alcohol. You can't use the word child, so it's difficult to have these legitimate conversations about what you wanted to be as a child. You can't use the word force, which makes it difficult to talk about forced orgasms. Blood is automatically screened by some companies, and so it's difficult for people who want to produce menstrual porn. And this is a really interesting example of one producer, Miss Naughty, who had all of her videos removed from Vimeo, and she wrote to them to ask her to define pornography, define sexually explicit, so she could have some clarity and then just edit it accordingly. And she asked all of these questions like, well, if you see the genitals, is that explicit? If you see nipples, is that explicit? Is only female nipples, male nipples? What does that even mean? If the subject deals with sex, but what if it's simulated? What if it exists to arouse, but there's no actual nudity? What if someone gets aroused by images of feet? And as you can see, Vimeo just replied that they review each video on a case-by-case basis. There's no exclusive definition they use to determine whether it violates the community guidelines. No criteria available to assist people to understand or try to comply. So at the same time of them being shut out of these revenue streams, tube sites are now trying to co-opt and profit from independent pornographies as well. And a few years ago on International Women's Day, there's a tube site called Pornhub, which launched a female director series. And they wrote to a number of feminist producers around the world, and they said, can you share your work with us for free, but for mass exposure? And they pitched it as this really altruistic measure to promote women-friendly porn and to showcase how the industry had evolved. And producers across Australia, the US, Europe, UK all got together online in this kind of furious discussion about it, because given that there were small producers that were being asked to provide free content that would generate advertising revenue for a multi-million-dollar tube site, it seemed obviously more like a capitalistic endeavor than any kind of altruistic contribution to International Women's Day. But Pornhub is owned by a Canadian company called MindGeek, which owns the majority of the tube sites. And there's a really great documentary by Overdee called Pornographies, the New Sex Multinationals, and it was on SBS a couple of years ago. And it exposes their very anti-competitive business practices of basically buying up all the production companies and then pirating content in order to become a kind of single monopoly and owner of production and distribution. So feminist producers were really furious about being used as part of this respectability campaign for a company whose CEO had been recently arrested. And they thought they were being embroiled in this attempt to clean up Pornhub's image. And what does that mean for a movement that is supposed to be about ethical practices of distribution and production? So if you've made some incredible content, but then it might be featured alongside transphobic tags, or you've promised something to your performers in terms of where it might end up, and you can't guarantee that anymore if you give it to Pornhub. So it was a really interesting conversation, because it was clear that feminist pornographies were not just well, firstly, it was clear that even though we have this kind of democratization of content potentially, the profits are still very much centralized. And feminist pornographies were seen as not simply like a formula, like add women and stir. It's not like we just want more women in porn or more queers in porn. Actually, around the world, this fundamental tenet was being iterated that feminist pornographies were about the process, not just the product. And as one producer warned, the best way to stop a subversive movement is to buy it. The best way to kill feminist porn is to swallow it. So to conclude, because I want to leave some time for chats, but regulators and porn producers are having like fundamentally different conversations about what pornography is, about what it does, who it's for. And in their more commercial and conservative iterations, independent or alternative pornographies present more of an appeal for diversity, for inclusion, towards a kind of pluralistic vision of participation, which does not always eventuate. But in their more radical iterations, if we listen to what's underneath, and if we actually listen to what sex workers are saying, what performers are saying, rather than the marketing that we hear from the producers. The movements go beyond representational critiques, and actually I think they're issuing a more destabilizing challenge that deconstructs how and why we categorize and produce and regulate sexual material in a specific way. And they're challenging what kind of bodies, fluids, genders, practices are seen as desirable, visible, intelligible, participating in community health promotion activities, promoting development of consent cultures. And they're doing all this in the face of economic and technological and regulatory challenges. So there's this, firstly, a tangled web of regulation that seeks to ensure that sexual representations are deliberately kept out of public space through classification, broadcasting, criminal customs legislation that constantly undervalues and underestimates. If you think back to the stories at the beginning of like the experience of what it was like to be at the Berlin Porn Film Festival, or what it was like to be at the Feminist Porn Conference, the legal and public debates really undervalue and underestimate the political, social, cultural value of being able to share sexual images with one another in public spaces. And secondly, although the communication technologies have sparked this cultural revolution in terms of the content being created, so there is increasingly diverse content being created, there's also democratization of the process as well, because it's increasingly decentralized. But the broader economic structures behind porn means that the distribution is still largely centralized, and the promise of equal participation in these online economies is very much limited. And then lastly, despite being integral to the commercial development of new technologies and platforms, sex workers and adult businesses are now largely just treated as expendable. So while sex workers and porn industries have been drivers of new technologies, their businesses have been used to boost platforms, to promote products. Now they're being scapegoated by these terms of use policies that simply treat sex as collateral damage. That's it.